Good morning and welcome to the World Leaders Forum at Columbia University, co-sponsored by the East Central European Center and the Harriman Institute. This forum, established over a decade ago, is playing host to an extraordinary number of distinguished guests this week, including the leaders of Japan, Tunisia, and the Philippines. This morning, we are deeply honored to welcome President Bronisław Komorowski, President of Poland, and his wife, Anna Komorowska. Welcome. The First Lady of Poland. Could I also acknowledge my wife, Jean Mignano Bollinger. I'd also like to welcome the Polish Ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Schnepp. Please stand. And Consul General Zeomeka. Thank you. Welcome. History, and in particular the events of the 20th century, has found Poland at the center of global conflicts and currents, from the crucible of the Second World War to the strictures of communism to the recent global recession. Today, the nation stands as a model of economic dynamism, astute governance, and some might say good fortune. Now fully established in the West, Poland has marked its 10th year as a member of the European Union this past May, and it remains the fastest growing nation in the Union. While the rest of the continent faced extraordinary instability and uncertainty following the 2008 financial crisis, Poland remained the only EU country to see growth during that period. In its present-day relations with its neighbors and one-time occupiers, Germany and Russia, one can see conflicting desires of a nation to transcend its past and embrace a new narrative, while not forgetting the difficult lessons of the last century. This is a fitting moment to consider Poland's complex history and its promising future. This month marked the 75th anniversary of the invasion of Poland and has witnessed the selection of Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk as the next European Council president. 25 years have passed since the Polish Roundtable talks, landmark negotiations that set the stage for the nonviolent transformation of Polish politics. This forum at Columbia is inspired by the spirit of openness and engagement embodied by those legendary negotiations. Here to introduce President Komorowski is Professor Mazurek, an accomplished historian and scholar who this year was selected to hold a newly endowed chair in Polish Studies. The Polish Studies appointment reaffirms Columbia's commitment to furthering the examination of Eastern European history and culture, and we anticipate future opportunities to commend Professor Mazurek for her work and to celebrate this new connection as this semester progresses. Now please welcome her to the podium to say a few words about our distinguished guest.
Thank you, President Bollinger. Columbia, this truly global university, has a long and rich tradition of teaching Polish language, culture, history, and Poland-related international affairs that reaches back to the beginning of the 20th century. Among those who promoted Polish studies in the past, I would like to mention the late Professor Manfred Kridl, the only holder of the Adam Mickiewicz Chair of Polish Literature and Language, And I would also like to mention Ms. Anna Freilich, under whose diligent guidance Columbia students have polished their Polish language for nearly 35 years now. Today, Poland witnesses a special moment of international recognition that finds its specific expression in creating the endowed chair of Polish Studies at Columbia University. I'm very happy to be a part of the Columbia community in this role and contribute to the advancement of Polish studies in collaboration with Department of History, East Central European Center, the Harriman Institute, the Blinken European Institute, and many others. I would like to acknowledge the benefactors of the Polish chair, some of whom are present today with us, Dr. John Mitzgiel in particular, who played an essential role in creating the endowment. I would like to thank all the friends of Poland in the Columbia community, Mr. Ambassador Ryszard Sznepf and Ms. Consul General Ewa Juńczyk-Ziomecka for joining us. Thank you also to Columbia Programs and Events, Public Safety, and all those here today who made this special event possible. President Komorowski's political career started already in high school when he became an anti-communist activist and continued with his work on behalf of the Workers' Protection Committee and in the movement for the defense of human and civil rights. During the years of opposition, he also worked as a printer, journalist, and publisher of the underground press and was frequently arrested. During a period of martial law imposed by the communist regime in December 1981, he was interned without charge. After the collapse of communism, President Komorowski served as a member and also as the spokesperson of the Polish parliament, the Sejm. He was involved in party leadership activities and also held the post of Minister of National Defense. President Komorowski was elected president in the spring of 2010, and since then, he has been a steady and popular force, taking an increasingly strong role as a defender of European democratic values. His personal and very successful leadership serves now as a bulwark in domestic politics and has hugely contributed to strengthening Poland's strategic position in international affairs. I'm extremely happy to welcome our distinguished speaker, President Bronisław Komorowski. For me personally, this is a double pleasure because we have at least two special things in common. First, we both love history, and second, we both graduated from the same history department at Warsaw University. Please join me in welcoming the President of Poland, Mr. Bronisław Komorowski.
Szanowny panie rektorze, drodzy państwo,
Rector,
to dla mnie
ladies and gentlemen,
miła i
it
ważna
is
chwila,
an
móc
exceptionally
wystąpić
important and nice
w
opportunity to
Uniwersytecie
be able to
Columbia
speak
w
at
Nowym
the
Jorku
Columbia
i móc
University,
opowiedzieć
New York,
o
and be able to tell you a
wolności
story
Polski.
of Poland's freedom.
Wolność jako pojęcie
Freedom
jest niewątpliwie jednym z tych
as a
elementów,
concept
z tych wartości,
is
które
undoubtedly one of the
miały nie
values
tylko gigantyczny wpływ
that not
na
only have had a
zachowania
gigantic
Polski i
influence on the
Polaków
behavior
w
of
ciągu
Poland
ostatnich
and
wieków,
people of
także w
Poland
ostatnich
throughout
dziesięcioleciach.
recent centuries, also
Obchodzimy
recent
właśnie
decades.
25-lecie
We are now
ponownie
celebrating the
odzyskanej
25th
wolności.
anniversary
Ale w
of
moim
freedom
przekonaniu
that we
wolność
have
miała
reclaimed.
również
But I
istotne
believe that
znaczenie dla
freedom also had a great
ukształtowania
significance for
relacji
the
polsko-amerykańskich
development of
i
Polish-American
ukształtowania
relations,
polskiego pozytywnego
and for the
stereotypu
shaping of a
dotyczącego
positive
Amerykanów i
stereotype that we in Poland have about
Pewnie
America
wzięło
and
się to z
Americans.
historii, to
I
znaczy
believe that the roots of it are in history.
polskie państwo w
At the time when the
chwiało się ku
Polish state in the 18th century was on decline, and it was threatened by the three neighboring powers, the countries that were getting ready for the partition of my country. At the time when Poland was trying to save its independence and its freedom by means of deep reforms that produced also the fact that in the world Poland adopted the second global modern constitution just after the United States, and our constitution in Poland was adopted 1 year before the French constitution was adopted. These were our attempts to save freedom by means of deep reform, by means of a deep change also in the republican spirit. And I am convinced that it is the reason for which there were so numerous people who lost Polish fight for freedom came to America. They brought their ideas, but also their fervent desire in the fight for freedom, and they continued their struggle on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. Amongst them, one could mention Kazimierz Pułaski and Tadeusz Kościuszko, and one is right to say that they are the heroes of freedom of both the United States and Poland. Poland disappeared from the map of Europe for 123 years. It never gave up freedom anyway, and at that time this notion was created that the United States, the country of free nation, where free people or people who are engaged in their own freedom were able to find shelter, that this country is in a way similar to us Poles from the perspective of attitude to freedom, and we in Poland at that time did not have freedom anymore. That was the course of the history, the time of the First World War that brought about a full liberation of Poland, again in the result of the war that was lost by three occupying powers: Russia, Prussia, Germany, and Austro-Hungarian Empire. Through the armed effort, Poland was reborn. It was also reborn in the result of the political engagement of France, that was a significant European power, and another power that was the United States of America. And I believe that it is an arch that brings this time together when Poland once was engaged on the side of Americans who were struggling for their own freedom, and then when Poland reclaimed that freedom after 123 years in the result of its own engagement. And also because Poland really focused that here in the United States the need of Poland's freedom had to be understood. I believe that sometimes it is easiest to give you an anecdote to make sure that history is understandable and acceptable for people. I've always thought how to tell Americans what is the root of Polish pro-American sympathy. Those roots are so evident, and we have so many pro-American feelings, and I am sure that these emotions in my generation were in the conviction of Poles that America symbolized freedom and a guarantee of freedom. I experienced it myself once, and I will tell you the story because it is quite nice. At that time I was in prison in Warsaw, together with regular thugs, regular offenders. Amongst them there was one guy who was like 2 meters tall, Janek Szelong. He was a regular thug, a bandit, a gangster. He was even a murderer. There were also political prisoners arrested, and we inhabited the same cells. The whole prison community were moved because it was not typical for them. This armored car entered the yard of the prison in the middle of the night, and interrogations went on. And then Janek Szelong comes up to me and tells me, "You, student, you, student." Well, it looks serious. Armored vehicle, the lights are on all night. You, student, perhaps your guys will come and fight you back. It was absolutely impossible, naturally, for any action to take us back by force, but it was very bad for me to admit it because I would lose my face in his eyes. So I made the smart face, and then I tell him, you know, everything may happen. So this really incited them even more.
kryminalnej i po jakimś czasie znowu poszeptali.
And then they again whispered,
Janek Szelok,
and Janek Szelong comes to me and says, "You student, remember,
za wolność.
we are also for freedom. We are with you.
I pamiętaj,
And remember, when your guys come to fight for you and take you back, the first thing we have to do, well, we have to bang the snitch, and then we hijack the car, and this is the most important thing. We take the car and to America."
nawet ten Janek Szelok,
Even Janek Szelong,
że po drodze jest jeszcze
you know, that man who didn't know that there was the Atlantic Ocean on the way. He had to cross. Even he associated the United States with freedom.
jest skojarzenie ogromnej większości.
Because this is what a great majority of Poles think about the United States. They associated the United States with freedom, freedom of citizens, but also political freedom.
Narodów innych państw, o które społeczeństwo
The freedom of other nations and other countries. The American people were fighting for in the beaches of Normandy, then during the First World War, and then participating in our fight for the freedom of my generation of people from the Solidarity movement.
warto pamiętać, że to poczucie
And
wspólnoty
it is important to remember that this sense of community,
jest istotne także
the foundation of freedom, is also so much important to understand Polish attitude, not only towards the United States, but also other countries of our region.
tego, że
Obviously, I am aware
wiele narodów
that many nations,
ze względu na to, że historię tak naprawdę poznaje się własnego narodu,
because you understand, you realize what the history of your nation is when you look at the histories of your families. A history of a nation is a sum of the histories of families, so it is quite natural that every nation remembers best its own history, and every nation is most sensitive to its own history. There are so many nations who are deeply convinced that their share is very difficult and painful. History. And the Poles, in a way, too. I am sure that they were absolutely convinced about incredibly negative history that we had to carry because of the fact that Poles are located between two huge and powerful European nations, Germans and Russians. Those who know a little bit the history of those two nations, Germans and Russians, can imagine without any difficulties what the life was for us between those two huge powers. But I also have to admit that the sense of bad history is now somehow disappearing. Poland and people of Poland think more and more often that perhaps the history has changed. Something has moved, that perhaps we are now at the stage when we will be able to think positively about the future of our country, that we will be able to trust in the good future of our region, because there are all signs that indicate that we are slowly catching up and making up for all those difficult history elements from the past, and perhaps we will be able to avoid some traps in the future and we will develop safely. In our people in Poland, there is something quite interesting now. They feel a little bit better in the result of their own successes, economic successes and political successes. They also start to look around with more kindness and lesser sense of threat. It is quite an interesting phenomenon, and I would like to recommend it to a deeper analysis, but it is absolutely objective. A generation of people of solidarity that deeply restored Poland, transformed Poland, opened it to the world, at the same time introduced a significant breakthrough in the relations with our neighbors in the name of our common care for freedom, and experiencing not only our own freedom, but also the freedom of the neighboring nations. And this is why we can see a very unbelievable phenomenon, which is a very deep and very genuine Polish-German reconciliation. It started with churches, Polish and German churches, in the 60s, but only democracy and freedom in Poland after 1989 could allow for the initiation, the launching of those incredibly spontaneous actions for the restoration of Polish-German positive feelings. It was not easy when you take into account the fact that there is not a single family in Poland, I believe, who didn't lose at least one member of this family family to German hands. Some families were totally erased. So this is really a symptom of today's Poland. But that's not all. We are also very much involved in the thinking that it is worthwhile introducing the same breakthrough and reconciliation in Polish-Russian relations. This is the second part of this, gigantic neighbor. But it takes two to tango. Two parties must be interested in the process. And Polish experiences that the reconciliation of the peoples, the nations, it is not fully possible without the participation in the democratization processes. A society that is not democratic is not capable of reconciliation. It is not able to reconcile on the basis of the truth, even the most terrible truth. Those who are still in the, still pressed by undemocratic state will not be able to reconcile. Poland has also reconciled very much with Ukrainians. Our history with Ukrainians is very bloody. It started in the 17th century. At the time in the Polish state, Ukrainians, Cossacks at the time, were the authors of different riots and insurgencies, and we were fighting against them with very much bloodshed. In the result of that, in the lands that are populated by mixed ethnic populations to the east of today's Poland during the Nazi occupation, the massive murders were committed mainly by Ukrainians. But Poles were also shooting, and these were not blanks they were shooting. That was like slaughter, similar to the slaughter in the Balkans later on. It was the ethnic cleansing, and we were able to carry this burden. And today it is difficult to imagine a better neighbor for Ukrainians than Poland. We experienced it very deeply in the name of the conviction that freedom is not only our cause, but that the freedom of our neighbors is also in our interest, because we want to live safer and better in the world of people and nations who are free. That is a very interesting phenomenon of breaking also negative experiences from the Second World War. After the First World War, Poland was an independent nation for 19 years only. 19 years without a war. And before there were wars for the borders. There was this dramatic war that we won against Bolsheviks in 1920. But our independence in the period between the two world wars was very short, and it went collapsed at the beginning of the Second World War on the 1st of September 1939. 75 years ago, the German-Polish War was transformed onto the European War because France and Great Britain joined, and soon later it transformed into the World War. Poles participated in that war from the very beginning to the very end. For Americans, that war finishes a little later. Well, the Poles didn't really fight against the Japanese. Anyways, the war in Europe in which Poles participated lasted for almost 6 years. And Poles participated in actually almost all fronts from the very beginning until the very end. And the losses were incredible. A symbol of losses for Poland, most moving and most telling to the people of Poland, is the loss connected with our capital, the city of Warsaw. I believe that Warsaw is the only big European city that paid the tribute of blood and the result of the war activities 3 times. First in September 1939, when it was defended, it was bombed, it was damaged. Then there was the Jewish Warsaw Ghetto uprising. There was a small group of people, fighters, but with dramatic consequences for a great number of people who inhabited the Jewish quarters. And the most terrible price was paid after the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. It lasted for 63 days. And to picture to you the order of magnitude of the losses, well, I think that for you it would be good to know that something which you rightly consider to be a very dramatic, traumatic experience, which is the losses in the result of the World Trade Center 9/11 attacks. Every day of the Warsaw Uprising, this number of people were killed. They were shot down by the Germans every day for 63 days, day in, day out. And for all these days, the same number of people were murdered as those who were murdered on 9/11. And then Hitler issued an order to level the city of Warsaw, and this order was largely executed. So in the result of the defense of Warsaw in 1939, in the result of the action connected with the Holocaust and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and then the Warsaw Uprising, Warsaw became not only a symbol of our resistance, but also became a symbol of the losses that we incurred as a nation. The war was won for the whole world. The West felt that they won. Russia felt that it won. But for Poles, it was not a time of freedom, because it was the moment when the Iron Curtain went down on the Elbe River, and we stayed behind on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain. And it is worthwhile remembering, especially Americans should remember, that the Iron Curtain went down also in the result of the decisions of the great powers in Yalta in February 1945. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, on our side, we were always rioting against it. It was not our place. We were ruled by Russia. That was the source of our national oppression. They had been the source of our oppression for centuries. We were pushed inside the communist system, and the Polish soul couldn't accept it, because in our nature, we are people who feel very well in freedom. Sometimes we even feel too well in the conditions of freedom. And under the oppressive system, the system of bans, the system of orders, we feel as if we were deprived of air. That is why the 40 million strong nation, as we could, how we could, using different methods, means and capacities, capabilities, we were fighting for freedom. After the war, it was about the armed units. Then there were some attempts of the social riots and workers' strikes, tragedies connected with the fight against the communist regime, and the communist regime was fighting against the workers. Blood was shed at the fences of Polish factories, shipyards. There were also repressions in the area of culture, in the area of freedom, of religion, and there was a very difficult battle throughout all these ages. A new thing came in the 70s. The 70s was the time of my generation, to introduce a change, a generational change. We had this experience of a dramatic struggle of our grandfathers and our fathers, of the armed fight. So we rejected the armed fight in advance, and we decided not to use force, but we decided we will not set the political committees or party committees on fire. Instead of this, we wanted to build our own structures, and we built our own structures of social life underground. So these were the clandestine underground structures of society, press, publication. It is sometimes mistaken because people talk about samizdat. You know, samizdat was something different. The samizdat was the author retyped something, and then 10 people read his article. But in our country, we didn't have samizdat. We had clandestine publication and press, and thousands of copies of press and books. And I myself published and printed and distributed thousands and thousands of copies of such publications. It was a significant change. It is important to note another phenomenon connected with it. The underground clandestine press, when you read it, you can see how living it was and how diverse it was, but at the same time you could see how optimistic it was and how very much it was targeted not only at the questions connected with our own freedom. The underground press in Poland, I don't know whether in any other communist country there was some underground press. Perhaps they issued something after Gorbachev, but we had really thousands of clandestine printing houses and thousands of titles. Amongst them, there were such titles that didn't deal with Polish freedom at all. They focused on freedom of other nations. Well, for example, I was an editor of one of such papers, and the title was ABC. A, Adriatic; B, the Baltic Sea; and C, it was like the Black Sea. And it was devoted to the freedom of that region. And you could name, like, I don't know, 10 titles. They were a little bit like a hobby, but at the same time they revealed the deposits of our ability to think along the lines of not only our own Polish freedom. I recently received credentials of the ambassador of Albania, and I could confess to her, and it was a genuine confession, that I know relatively much about her country because I used to be a publisher of different articles about Albania. She couldn't believe that because she said that in the 80s nobody visited Albania. And then I said, well, I didn't go to Albania either, but we printed articles in the Polish underground clandestine press. You in the United States, you could write about Cuba, you could write about Eastern Europe, but we couldn't do anything. But we needed it. We needed to write, we needed to think, we needed to talk about the freedom. And from that, it is a short way to understand the current conviction of people of Poland that our freedom is a form of a commitment to the freedom of others. Poland today takes a position to support openness and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as well as the openness of the European Union. And Poland has consistently been an advocate of Eastern Partnership, and we have consistently supported Ukraine, with whom we didn't have different historical problems settled, but we support Ukrainians in their way towards freedom because we believe that their success is yet additional encouragement and instrument to present the question of the freedom of others as if it was our own Polish freedom. And to make it a little shorter, I would like to tell you one thing. It is true that Poland in recent years has been a country of success. Americans like listening about success. So I have to tell you that really it is a success that we got at a price of great risk and so much effort and pain. Every president would be so happy traveling around the world that he came from a country who has different achievements. I nod my head, my heart really is so happy, but I know how much it cost. I know what the beginning was. This freedom was not given to us. We tear that freedom from the enslaving powers with our nails and our teeth. And the 10 million strong movement of solidarity was a movement at the time when nobody even thought about Gorbachev. It was the beginning of the 80s. It was late 70s, early 80s, the 2 years of the Festival of Freedom, of solidarity, when we had 10 million strong movement of the solidarity of the workers that was anti-communist by nature, that was tolerated with pain and hatred, tolerated, however, by the communist regime. That was our power, that was our driving force, our driving engine to fight for freedom in the future. So when Glasnost and when Perestroika came, we were already there, free in our souls and in our hearts. We were well organized, and this is why this huge movement for freedom started in Poland, and then it spilled over Central and Eastern Europe. When in Poland the first non-communist government of Tadeusz Mazowiecki was established, and I had a great honor to be first the head of his office, and then I was Deputy Minister of National Defense in his government. The Soviet troops were all around in Poland, and the Berlin Wall was still standing, and it felt fine for the Berlin Wall. In most of the countries of the Eastern Bloc, nobody even thought about freedom. Nobody even dreamt about freedom. Perhaps they dreamt a little bit, and then I thought that it was really an excessive manifestation of optimism. But back then, we were ready, still prior to Perestroika, prior to bringing down of the Berlin Wall. And I really am so satisfied when I go to Germany and when I go to some other countries, and everyone stresses that this domino effect started in Poland, and then it spilled over the whole Central and Eastern Europe. And it is not because of Gorbachev. Gorbachev was just a conducive circumstance. He himself was a symptom of the bankruptcy of the communist system. political, economic, and moral bankruptcy of the communist system. Without perestroika, perhaps we would fail at the time, or we would have to use our clandestine press for 20 more years and spend time in prison. But we were successful because all those batteries of Polish freedom were fully charged. And in good conditions, we could launch our battle for our freedom and the freedom of others. And to boast a little bit more, I have to tell you that the achievements of Free Poland, whose 25th anniversary we are celebrating, also deserve attention. I am not an economist, but I really understand quite well that Poland is now on the 8th or 6th position in terms of our economy in the integrating Europe. Between 1990 and today, Poland increased the exports of Polish goods 17 times. And we never had negative economic growth, not a single year when all the European economy was going down. But we kept developing. It was the constant growing trend, and it has been so ever since. And that we have been able to really improve our economy by 20% in total. So our economy is much bigger, and it will be even bigger, and I'm convinced about it. We want to share the Polish success with others. First of all, with Ukraine, not only because we want Ukraine to be on the same side with us, because then we will be safer. But when Ukraine is on this side of the power and not the bad side of the power, then it simply will be stronger. We really want to make sure that we are engaged in the cause of the world of free people, safe people, secure people, and economies in development was as big and not as small. That is why Poland's engagement in Ukraine is not about the verbal support of their aspirations towards the Western world. It is also about the readiness to help Ukraine in the deep modernization of their country. We know that without the modernization effort, nothing can be done. We know that they have to modernize economic and political system. They have to modernize their armed forces. They must change rapidly. We were changing, and we were changing in such a pace that up to date, it is very difficult for us to believe ourselves. I have to admit to you, well, it was really astonishing for me. We started from like a total bankruptcy of the communist system. It was a very low level, and we had no other way out. And then when we think why we succeeded, I can really tell you with certainty, we didn't have any other way out. We had to introduce a deep reform. It was very painful socially. It was Leszek Balcerowicz's reform. Well, socialists built their economy and market. Well, glory to them. They really changed the people's attitudes. 2 years ago, President Gauck announced, and he was criticized very much by his own countrymen when he said that Polish people work more than Germans, that an average Polish worker works more hours in Poland than an average German worker. So it is not only about Polish ability to fight for freedom, it is also the ability to work, to strengthen our freedom. It's about the openness to others, and it is also the consistency in the action for the reform of your own country. And I am sure that it can be a very good sign for the future, for our engagement in different world structures, NATO, the European Union, and hopefully also in the process of the integration of the whole Western world to encompass both America and Western Europe. Thank you very much.
Ja mam, nie potrzeba, mam, dziękuję. You have a question?
Mr. President, thank you very much for those extremely interesting remarks. I'd like to open it up now for students in particular to ask questions. There are 2 microphones. I'll come back once you are lined up there. Mr. President, could I begin with a question? I'm sure many people will want to ask you about Russia and Ukraine, but I'd like to start with a different subject, taking the theme that I think defined your remarks, which I in particular found extremely interesting, and that is deep in the Polish citizenry, deep in the Polish character, a desire for freedom. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, general freedom. And I applaud that, of course. We all applaud that. The question I have is, how do you account for the differences among the former countries of the Soviet regime? The countries that came out of that, along with Poland, some have succeeded in holding on to that freedom, like Poland, and others are challenged in that. Hungary, for example, today. So what is the explanation for the differences we're finding?
To jest bardzo proste.
It is very simple.
Wystarczy, żeby kto był, żeby przypomniał sobie, jak wyglądał Budapeszt.
It is enough to remember what the Budapest was like in the late 80s, and what Warsaw was like, what Warsaw is like today, and what Budapest is like today.
Obozu socjalistycznego.
In the socialist camp, Hungarians were the most fortunate ones from the perspective of the standard of living, as well as the
Konsumowania dóbr.
access to different goods, consumable goods that were generated, produced in the free market economy. Poland, we talked about ourselves like that. We had almost nothing in our stores, but we definitely were the most joyful and happy barrack in the socialist camp. It was really the most funny place. There were so numerous jokes, and Czechs tell this joke when this, dog is running along the Polish-Czechoslovakian border in the 80s, and where are you going? To Poland. There is nothing to eat there. And then the dog says, I know that there's nothing to eat, but you can bark. And there were thousands and thousands of such jokes, and all of them tell the truth. Poland was not only the biggest barrack, because we had 40 million people. We were the most untamed, because there were different uprisings and different insurgencies. But Poland was also the place where the greatest enclaves of independence of thinking. For example, the church that was independent. It was not penetrated by the secret police. We had also independent, privately held farming. We also had private trade, private craftsmen, and we didn't have it in other communist countries. Then, however, relatively early, for example, in Hungary after 1956, after the Soviet invasion to Hungary, different reforms were introduced that allowed the Hungarians to use, for example, the production of Coke, Coca-Cola, I mean, and other, tasty products. And Poles went to Hungary to buy the stuff, and they stored it at home. There were 2 countries who lived better than others in the socialist camp. These were Hungarians and the Germans in East Germany. Germans in East Germany got additional financial injections and different reliefs throughout the whole socialist period and by the whole socialist camp, so that it was not that visible that people have such a good standard of living in West Germany and so terrible standard of living in East Germany. So it was artificially overinflated. And Hungarians, they used the outcomes of the Kadar reform. And they were quite okay by the end of the 80s. When the system collapsed, in Poland, it was a total disaster. It was a total bankruptcy. The inflation was several 100%. When we took our salaries, and before you got home, the salary was like 1/3 less worth. It was great unemployment. The markets went down. The economy was in debris, and it couldn't be worse. And Poles remember it well today. It was painful, but you can see, well, the stores are now full. You can buy everything, although at that time it was painful. But Germans, the Hungarians, they think the other way around. Well, look, it was supposed to be better, but see, everything went down. They used to come to us to buy, I don't know, bell pepper or wine or something, and today, nothing. And it's a terrible frustration for Hungarians. They have to reconstruct their country deeply. This is what we did not only because we wanted to very much, we simply had to, because otherwise we would die. And now we are able to draw benefits from it. The fact that they started from a better level, that really released them from some effort, now it really takes them down. The same goes for Germans from East Germany, like billions and billions of Deutschmarks were introduced to that economy with no result. If you go from Berlin to Warsaw, you can see where Poland starts.
All right. Yes, please proceed.
Thank you very much. My name is Bart Zalaitis. I'm representing a Polish club at Columbia University. First of all, I want to say I'm very proud that you have visited our university, and I want to say thank you very much. Also to you, President Bolger, thank you very much for making this happen. But I'm also very proud to represent a group of very talented students that are to my right from Polish Club at Columbia University. But I do have a question, of course. What I wanted to ask is that relations between Poland and the U.S. seems to be as good as ever, but I feel they're not as perfect as they could be. And as students, we always look into the future. We would like to know if there's anything as a Polish students at the American university, is there anything that we can do to make these relations a little better or to make the future better for us as well? Thank you. Dziękuję.
It is never so good that you cannot do something to make it better. That is the first thing. And the second thing is that Polish-American relations, in terms of national emotions, have always been good. However, definitely, as far as it is about the improving of the image of Poland in the eyes of an average American, there is still a long way for us to go. Also, to really widespread information that Poland today is not Poland of people who come to America to find a job, because they can find a job closer home in Europe without any problem. They can travel all around Europe, visit all the European countries, and it requires the shift in the American attitude. Poles do it, and Poles travel to the United States less frequently, and they go to Great Britain, to France, to Germany, without any limitations. That is why Poles do not really understand the question of the visa limitation, and it is like the visa regime. We are bound by the visa regime, and other countries from our region are not bound by it. But we are not in despair, because we can travel in many other places without any limitations. I think Americans have to reflect on this. What is the purpose of the visa regime? Why it is introduced and why it applies to Poland? And the second thing which should be done is to deepen the cooperation in many areas, taking into account the fact that we have the community of interest, taking definitely into account the differences of the potentials of our countries. Poles consistently for the last 25 years have supported a strong presence of the United States in Europe, because we believe that it is in the interest of both Europe and America and Poland. We want Americans in Europe. You can't say this about all the nations, because for different reasons, also historic reasons, their views are different. We want to see the deepened transatlantic cooperation in NATO, but also in the efforts to seek other forms of cooperation of the European Union with Canada, for example. And Poland is very deeply engaged in it, so there are such common areas. Another area of common thinking and common action can be security in a broad sense. For us, the voice of the United States about Ukraine and earlier about Georgia is a voice that is clear. We want to hear such a voice, and we want to hear it even stronger, because we know that only such a voice is properly heard and properly understood in Kremlin. And we know Russians a little bit, and I'm afraid that we know Russians much better than many other European nations. This is why the position taken by America in crisis situations, if they touch Eastern Europe, is a source of encouragement for us to think that in the area of security it is worthwhile doing as much as possible to be close to each other. It is happening. President Obama talked about it, and we talk about it in all our contacts. We talk about the necessity to strengthen our cooperation in the area of defense and security.
Other questions? Mr. President, you're going to get me then. So let's talk about Ukraine. So let's say there are two views that are playing out in the American media. One view is the West and the United States made a very big mistake in the 1990s in pushing Ukraine to join NATO, and that was perceived by the Russian people and Russian leadership, and Putin in particular eventually, as a direct assault on...
I'm sorry, I don't remember. Please?
Is that...
Ale tu też drugie, nic nie było słychać. I'm sorry. Please. Okay.
So I asked that we talk more about Ukraine, and I'm projecting two views that one hears and reads in the US media. One view is that a mistake was made by the United States and the West in the beginning in the 90s in pushing Ukraine or urging Ukraine to become part of NATO, and that was viewed by Russians as a direct assault on their sovereignty. And so what we're seeing today is a response to that, not to be excused by this argument, but one in which we have to understand that there is a kind of legitimacy to the underlying feelings. And once those are addressed more directly, of an independent Ukraine, not part of NATO, that would really solve the problem. The other view, let's say, is that Russia is unstoppable given the kind of framework that we have today. Its ambitions are much beyond not only the Crimea and Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, but Ukraine itself and other countries. And therefore, a much more forceful and immediate response is needed to stop that continued aggression. How would you help us understand what is happening?
It is worthwhile remembering one thing. Russia has always been able to pursue highly pragmatic policy. Russia has always been able to do it, and it is important to remember that after 1989, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, different red lines were drawn. The red lines that couldn't be crossed because behind that red line Russia would go nuts. And people said, well, everything's fine, you can build a free economy in Poland, you can cooperate with the West, but don't go crazy. No NATO, it's out of the question. It is not true that Poland and other Central European countries wanted to be in were wanted in NATO. They didn't want us. They wanted us to give up. They wanted us to be satisfied with, some quasi-support. Nobody invited us. Nobody welcomed us in NATO and the European Union. It is only about the development of events when Russia started to murmur, like Yanaev's riot. It forced specific forms of cooperation, also American-Polish cooperation and a NATO-Polish cooperation. Later, what were we offered? We were not offered membership in NATO. We were offered the Partnership for Peace, a long way at the end of which we didn't know what was there. We took that risk. We said, fine, we are not getting anything else. Let's go along that way. At the end of it, perhaps there is nothing, or perhaps we will be able to make it and become a member. We succeeded. It is not that someone gave us NATO. We really had to fight to get there, because this is what it is with the Western world. The Western world doesn't appreciate its force. The Western world doesn't know that they can dictate things, and the Western world is afraid to show strength, because with showing the strength, political, economic, or military, if you show the strength, it can be risky. People don't like strength, but we didn't have any way out. We don't like risk, but in the past we preferred the risk than to waiting for those to come to us and really strangulate us. That was what we had to do, and then Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary became a member of the alliance. Russians at that time said, no, this is a scandal. We will not be able to swallow it. And then they introduced the ban on Polish food. And then it turned out that most of the companies that were covered by that ban managed perfectly well. And when President Medvedev came to me with a visit, he's a very interesting and a very nice man, and I could show him a very clear evidence that in a period of a few years of the ban on the Polish meat in Russia, the amount of Polish meat sold in the Russian market increased significantly, and he couldn't believe. And later on, he came and said, "Okay, it doesn't make sense. The bans don't make sense," and it is going to be this time too. A few years later, they reconciled with the idea. Poland always wanted to take another way. You didn't want to listen to Russia. You prefer to be with this, rotting, decaying West. Be with them. Germans were always very close to the Czechs, and Hungarians are almost Austrians. But there's absolutely no way for any Baltic state, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, be there. No, it is not possible. It is out of the questions. And many politicians in the world really believe that it is so important. They experienced it with great difficulty. I remember from the earlier period in this underground press, I still have many friends in Russia because we cooperated with them in Russia. One of the prime ministers of Russia, Gaidar, perhaps you remember that name, Gaidar, very much focused on free market, a very nice person, very kind, friendly, open to Poland, people of Poland. I'm not going to forget the conversation with him I had once. He said, "Bronek, you can do everything, but with one exception, because neither Russian will ever accept it. When you go to NATO, it's over, it's done, it is not possible." But we became a member of NATO, and the world goes on. The Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians became a member of NATO. Russia was insulted for 2 years, got angry, and then had to reconcile with it. And it is going to be like this all the time, until Russia finally understands that in spite of being insulted at the reality, it can a little bit similar, modernized. This is what Medvedev was thinking. Let us modernize Russia economically, socially, culturally, in terms of international cooperation. He wanted to see modernization, but it is always easier not to modernize. It is always easier to terrorize. It is always easier to refer to the greatness, not by means of the reconstruction of your own country so that people had a better standard of living, safer, wiser. It is always better to refer to the greatness which is understood as the restoration of the zone of influence. This is simply easy. And Russians are still getting it, and they can be deceived by it. But I can promise you that if Ukraine succeeds, if Ukraine runs to the West, or if Ukraine introduces in its own country the standards of the Western world, if it is reformed, then in 10 years' time, an average Russian will think, well, if Ukrainians could succeed, we should be able to succeed even more. They could, we can do it too. And it will be also the other way around. If Ukraine is halted in its path towards the West successfully, then, well, God save us. In Russians' heads, this conviction will be stronger that their greatness is about banning others on developing the way they want, because Russia's way is the best way. Look around, all the neighborhood, the whole world, they must listen to us. They can't do anything about us. This is the worst thing that can happen to Russia. The key to modern Russia, Russia we would like to cooperate with and could cooperate with safely, is the modernization of Ukraine. What will happen? What is the reason of Maidan? What is the cause of Maidan? It is not like, megalomany, but when you look at the number of young Poles who in the 70s and in the 80s went to the West to get a job, some manual job for a few Deutschmarks or dollars, and on that occasion they got acquainted with mechanisms, people, values, democracy. Those are the people who started the revolution of the solidarity in Poland later on. And moreover, Ukrainians came to us to free Poland. We opened the border with Ukraine. We have a visa-free regime with Ukrainians in the local regions, and Ukrainians come to us and they can work. We did it also with Russia. The European Union, the Western world, didn't want to accept the visa-free regime to be broader than it is foreseen in the European law. And we forced the European Union to make sure that the visa-free regime covers the territory up to Gdańsk, a big Polish seaport, because we want to open up and we want to show them, because we know that this is the path to have their minds and their souls changed. In Maidan in Kiev, there were largely those Ukrainians who had been full of their images of Poland, and they wanted to take the Polish way. And now young Russians look at Kiev. And if Kiev succeeds and follows the path of the Western world of values, they will also want to have the same world in their own country. Ukraine is the key to Russia. We all want Russia. I believe that Poles want Russia most.
Mr. President, your staff is indicating that you must go on to your next meetings. Would you listen to just 2 questions to take with you?
Jeszcze raz, repeat. 2 questions?
Hold on.
A proszę bardzo, oczywiście.
Of course, no problem.
No wyszło na to, że Polacy nie tylko najdłużej pracują.
It turns out that Poles not only work very long, but they also speak too long.
I'm getting direct indications that you must leave. I think the things that you've said recently in this are not only extremely compelling, but I think they cover a range of questions that people had in their minds here, and students in particular. So let me say, on behalf of Columbia, we really appreciate your coming here and would love to welcome you back at any time that you would like to be here. Thanks very much.